Hey there, welcome back to our Sky Tonight program. My name is Seth Mayo. I'm the curator of astronomy for the Loman Planetarium. And this episode, we're covering the dates of August 23rd through August 29th. We're going to begin by saying farewell to the constellation of Virgo and the bright star of Spica within it, all setting towards the west. And then we're going to look towards the south and look at Sagittarius, the Teapot asterism inside of it, and the Milky Way. There's an interesting connection between all three of those celestial objects. And then we'll shift our gaze towards the east and southeast, where we're still finding Jupiter and Saturn. And specifically, we'll talk about Jupiter and some interesting moon transits going across the planet that you might be able to see through a telescope by the end of the week. So let's get to it. If you've been checking out the west lately, you may have noticed a constellation and a relatively bright star that have been getting lower and beginning to set at this time of the year. But also, if you've been looking in the west, you've probably noticed this really bright object, which is the planet Venus. It's really hard to miss the brightest planet in our sky, and it's well positioned in the west right now. But if you do find Venus, around it are some stars that kind of look like the Big Dipper. Of course, it's not the Big Dipper, but it kind of looks like it. It helps to be in a little bit of a darker sky to see this, but if you do see it, you may be finding the stars of Virgo, the maiden, or the Virgin. And there she is in the sky. To give you an idea of what's going on here, her head is right about here. This is her body, and these are her legs. The picture, of course, always helps. So she is considered a springtime constellation, and inside of her, the brightest star in this constellation is one you can see just to the left of Venus. This one right here, this is called Spica. And Spica is the 16th brightest star in the sky. The name is Latin for ear of wheat or grain, because if you notice in the picture, she is holding a little bit of wheat right here in her hands. So that star sits right there as the ear of wheat star. And it's a fascinating star that we've talked about before. It's a binary star, so two stars going around each other. But these two stars orbit really close to each other, so close, they only take 4 days to go around each other. And since they're near each other, you can't resolve the two through a telescope. These are what are called a spectroscopic binary star system. So that means the only way to detect that there are two stars is by measuring their Doppler shift. So as one star gets closer to us in its 4-day orbit, the light from that star gets kind of squished towards us, or what's called blue shifted. The light is kind of heading more towards the blue part of the spectrum. As the star moves away from us, you'll notice that the light is stretching from us. That's called red shifting. The light is kind of going more towards the red part of the spectrum. So that light squishing towards us and then being stretched away from us is the way that we can detect that there are two stars going around one another. They're actually so close that their tidal interaction, their gravitational interaction between the two, stretches the stars and makes them look like kind of football shape. So this is a really interesting pair that's well studied at about 250 light years away. These are really big and hot blue-white stars. The main star of Spica, you call it Spica A, that star is massive, much brighter than our sun, and much larger as well. So that's a great little star system there. 16th brightest star in the sky, getting pretty low in the west. One thing we talk all about in the springtime is how to find it. And you've probably heard us mention this over and over again, but it's always worth mentioning. And that is a little mnemonic that you can say, starting with the Big Dipper. And here's the Big Dipper off to the northwest, that kind of spoon or pot-like shape in the sky. For us here, more in southern latitudes, the Big Dipper is getting kind of low in the sky. If you're more north, you usually have a pretty good view of this asterism. So what you can do is with the handle of the Big Dipper, these three stars right here, you can arc with the handle because they make this arcing shape. And if you arc with the handle, that will lead you to this star right about here. That star is very bright, the fourth brightest in our night sky. This one is Arcturus, which is part of Boötes the herdsman right there. So very bright star that you find there, a closer one to us as well. And that star from there can help you to find Spica. So what sometimes people will say is you spike to Spica, or that you shoot to Spica. But I like spike because it kind of sounds like Spica, right? So you spike to Spica. Again, arc to Arcturus from the Big Dipper, and then spike to Spica, and that can help you to find that star inside of Virgo that you notice is kind of setting in this area in the sky. So we can say farewell to those objects until they rise again for another season. If you've been checking out the south lately, you may already know about those wonderful summertime objects that are bright and easily noticeable, especially that big S shape right here. That's Scorpius the Scorpion, with the heart of the Scorpion, this red supergiant star known as Antares. Scorpius is a great constellation. We've also mentioned to the left of Scorpius, or near his tail, are the stars of Sagittarius that we find right there. Sagittarius is a half-man, half-horse, what's called a centaur, who is also known as the Archer. Almost looks like he's about to shoot Scorpius in the back. Some people even say that this Archer is avenging the death of Orion, because in Greek mythology, in one story, Scorpius actually kills Orion, that mighty hunter and warrior, usually who you find in the wintertime. So anyway, Sagittarius is sitting right next to it. Now, what's great about Sagittarius is you can find a very famous asterism in this area. And just as a reminder, an asterism is a grouping of stars, much like a constellation, but it's not as formal as a constellation. So an asterism is usually regional and made up of relatively bright and easily noticeable stars. And a lot of times asterisms are just easier to understand. They're just simpler pictures than the many ancient constellations that we find in the sky. And so the Teapot that we find are the brightest stars in Sagittarius right here. Just to give you an idea of what's going on, this is the handle of the so-called Teapot. There's the lid, and there is the spout of the teapot. And you know, it kind of looks like a teapot if you look closely in the sky. More so, in my opinion, than a half-man, half-horse centaur. But anyway, great asterism to look at in the summertime. Now, what's so cool about this time of the year is how this teapot can relate to the Milky Way, this beautiful kind of foggy band in the sky that makes up the disk of our galaxy. We mentioned it a bit more a couple episodes ago. So what's kind of neat is at this time of the year, if you stay just a tad bit later, but not too late, what you can imagine is that as this teapot continues its western trek, what you'll notice is it almost looks like some celestial being is tipping the teapot, and as it's doing so, steam is rising out of the spout, and that steam would be represented by the Milky Way. I think that's kind of a cool thought to think of. And that kind of helps me to remember what's going on in this area. If you can't see the Milky Way in your sky due to light pollution or high humidity or any other factor like that, clouds, if you can find the bright stars of Sagittarius, you can imagine that there's this steam billowing out of that spout. And so this is a great time of year to see this happen, because this is when Sagittarius is well tilted and you don't have to stay up too late to kind of see this in action. So maybe you can find these great summer objects, especially the asterism of the teapot inside of Sagittarius, pouring out its kind of celestial tea as you see the steam that makes up the Milky Way, the brightest part of the disk of our galaxy that you find at this time of the year. August has been a great month for the two planets that you can find rising at the east and southeast. If you recall, at the beginning of the month, the planet Saturn, that rises a little bit earlier and is not as bright as the other planet, right here was at opposition, so that's when it was closest to us in its orbit. Saturn is great. Even though it's not as bright as the other planet, still shines. It's still very noticeable in the sky. But the one that's even brighter, and the one that we just went through opposition, is a planet a little bit and below it to the left, and that, of course, is Jupiter. Right there. Jupiter is really bright right now. It's still very close to us. Great planet to look at. Now, what's also great, and I always mention about these two planets in particular, is to look at them through some type of optical aid. Binoculars are great if you have a pair of those, but even better if you have a telescope, or at least know someone with a telescope. The rings of Saturn are amazing, and for Jupiter, you can see the cloudy bands, including some of its moons. Now, speaking of its moons, there's something interesting going on at the end of this week, the evening of the 29th. Now, this depends on where you live and what you might be able to see, all right? But I can speak for North America and at least for parts of Europe, Africa, and the United Kingdom as well. For us here in North America, what you might find is what's called a transit. So we're going to zoom into Jupiter here, hundreds of millions of miles away. And as we get to it close in Stellarium, there's something really cool that you can see. And Stellarium does a good job of showing this. So if you ever want to predict when a moon is crossing over the planet, Stellarium is a great tool to determine when this is happening and if it's happening at all in your location. So you can see these little dots here. These are some of the moons, what are called the Galilean moons, the 4 largest moons of Jupiter that are big enough and bright enough to see through a regular telescope. And what you can find here is this little dot right on Jupiter's clouds. That is the shadow of a moon. What's kind of cool is we can click on the moon and that turns out to be Ganymede. So this is what's called a transit. And transits over Jupiter happen fairly often. They're not super rare, but they're very fleeting moments because the moons of Jupiter move very quickly. If I speed up time here, I actually see the moons move really quickly in the span of 10, 20, 30 minutes. You can see them kind of moving out of the way. But let's go back to kind of where we were earlier in the evening here. And I will tell you this is around 8, 9 o'clock in the evening, at least here in the East Coast of the United States. This is what we'd be seeing. So right when it gets dark, this is a good time to see the shadow of Ganymede, the largest moon of Jupiter, and the one that we saw in the last episode when we showed you the beautiful view from the spacecraft called Juno that actually had a chance to fly by Ganymede, the first time a spacecraft had flown by Ganymede in a couple decades. So that was an amazing video to watch. You can still watch it. Check out the last episode if you want to see that again. So Ganymede's shadow will be cast onto the beautiful cloud layers of Jupiter. Now, let's say you're more eastward from here, from the United States at least. We'll go across the Atlantic, go to the United Kingdom, Europe, and even Africa. And what you might find are 2 transits that happen because these actually happen earlier in the day. And for them, in that part of the world, it'll be evening and Jupiter will be up in the sky for them to notice this, all right? So if I go back a little bit here and turn off our ground, we might be able to do this here and show this to you. So we're going to go back in time. And as we do so, I'm going to focus on Jupiter here. We're going to actually zoom back in. And it's going to look a little warped here as we do this. But if you look carefully, you can see another moon cross. That is the moon Europa right there. So Europa will be crossing as well. And at the same time, we might be able to see Europa's shadow and Ganymede's shadow at the same time if you were in Europe, Africa, the United Kingdom, those parts of the world in your evening. And if you are there at the right time in the evening, you would see both of those shadows. And that's kind of neat to have a double transit of moons here. You'll find going across Jupiter. Sometimes you get triple transits, which don't happen all too often. But occasionally, if you're in the right place at the right time, Jupiter is well positioned in the sky. So you can look out for these kind of things using Stellarium or using kind of a sky calendar. Sometimes they'll mention when transits happen. And if you have a telescope to see the moons kind of cross over, especially their shadows, is a really awesome thing to observe. But for us here in North America, especially in the East Coast in the evening, we do have a chance to see this shadow of Ganymede crossing over Jupiter, and that's always neat to see these systems. They're not just a static planet. There's a lot going on around these worlds beyond Earth. Hey, you made it through another edition of our Sky Tonight program. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, please stop by the Museum of Arts and Sciences if you're in Daytona Beach, and definitely the Lohmann Planetarium. We are running shows daily, and if you want any more information about those programs, please check out our website. So hope to see you back here again, and if you ever watch a video, please don't hesitate to leave a comment, ask a question. We love the audience engagement. And if you want to fly through the universe with me live, tune into our virtual immersive presentation on Zoom from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. this Thursday the 26th for a program called Ask a Curator of Astronomy, where you can ask me any question you want about the universe, about the night sky, about spaceflight. And I'll try to answer those questions using our powerful and amazing visualization software of the universe. So if you want more information about that or to sign up, check out our website and our calendar to do that. So thank you very much, take care, and of course, happy stargazing.